Hello and welcome to the EMS Handoff podcast. This is David, along with my co-host Eric McCullough and Bradley Dean. We are your source for all things EMS. Tonight we're going to get started again, and this time we have no guests. It's just us three. So whatever we get into some great conversations when it's just us three. We'll have to see where we go. Tonight's topic is going to be very interesting, timely, with a lot of stuff that's going on out there. But before we get started, we always like to check in with those co-hosts of mine. So Bradley Dean, North Carolina, living it up, traveling to New York, and big spending out there. How's it going?
Well, I will tell you, New York was great. Had a great time with Jason and Amy and some of the people up there. The conference that they put on is awesome. I mean, even though we did it virtually, we had some people in attendance. So sorry we didn't have a show last week. I was late getting back, and my plane actually got delayed. I didn't get back till 11:30 that night.
And, old guys like that, they have to get in bed and, get that beauty sleep. So, what do you do? Mm-hmm. Eric McCullough over in Nashville, Murfreesboro, Middle Tennessee. What's going on, my friend?
Oh, nothing much. I'm hating this warm weather. This was supposed to be gone by now, and I've been fending off mosquitoes and spiders and stuff like that. And I was kind of hoping to enjoy some sort of autumn. I guess people will not be trekking to South Carolina or Knoxville for the fall colors anytime soon.
We made our way through Gatlinburg today, and there's some colors going on up there. I think, Rhonda went to the football game yesterday with our son, and they were expecting that 70-degree temperature. And, when there's about a 10-degree difference going in the upward direction, but that was kind of neat, though. They had it was Tennessee and South Carolina, and they had a refueler from our Tennessee unit here. And then they had a 2-ship of F-16s from South Carolina that came over and did a flyover. It's kind of neat little joint operation there. So, all right. Before we get started, we always like to thank our podcast partner, the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. JEMS has been a great partner to the EMS Handoff since we kicked off almost a year ago at this point in time. And we always like to kick people over to their website, jems.com, so they can check out all the great information that they have. And you can check out all of our previous episodes as well as our fellow podcast hosts. Make sure to go over and check them out. Check out all of our prior episodes and just see what JEMS has going on. They like to keep everybody up to date on all things changing in EMS. And also, we want to reach out to each one of our fans and say, hey, go by and check out the Pursuit Company and find our EMS Handoff line of merchandise. ThePursuitCo.com has our EMS gear, from our original logo to our Keep Back podcast line. They have everything that you need, from short sleeve, long sleeve, and even hoodies, as we hopefully get into some of that cooler weather soon here, Eric. We'll have to wait and see. So again, that's at thepursuitco.com. And I'm going to give one more shout out to our friends. He's a prior guest, but Tyler and the team at Foam Frat coming through clutch as I started a new class here recently, checking out some of their content. Make sure to go by foamfrat.com and see all of their stuff and see what they have to offer. Great content, very interesting, relevant, cutting edge on some of the topics. So all good stuff. Bradley Dean, it's time to get started with this week's episode. And you have something off the beaten path.
Yes. And it used to be that's where we would find all this stuff was, off the beaten path. People used to, be caught growing the stuff out in the woods and fields and, trying to hide it, but it's become a little bit more prevalent. So let's talk a little bit about marijuana and cannabis, as some people like to call it, NEMS.
NEMS.
So full disclosure, I will say that I do own stock in a couple of companies that deal with cannabis. I bought them when they were penny stocks, but as soon as I hit 420, I'm out.
No, I love it. Yeah.
So
you never know when you're going to get some financial advice here on the EMS Handoff. We cover all things EMS. So
I'm glad you guys caught that. But no, seriously, cannabis is probably the most widely used illicit drug in the United States. In doing some research and looking at stuff, we know that lots of places across the United States are starting to legalize cannabis within their states. But I think it's important to point out that even though it's legal inside the state, it's still illegal federally, under the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. But when we look at people and looking at the research, there's a lifetime prevalence of use of about 42 to 46%. So, almost 1 out of every 2 people that you encounter have at some point used marijuana. Now, I'm not going to ask you guys to disclose, but you do know how to puff, pass.
So I have to say this. I haven't used one of these references in quite a while. My wife knows exactly where I'm going, but there was a episode of The West Wing in which somebody accused White House staff. 1 of 3 in the White House were on some sort of illegal drugs, and so they got into a meeting with the senior staff, chief of staff, deputy chief of staff, communications director, press secretary, etc. He goes, to the 5 of us that are in the room. With that, it said, of the 5% of the people in this room, there are 2 of you that are against donor. I want to know when you're going to start sharing. But that may not be the best thing, especially in our profession.
Right. And even though it's considered a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, the medical use is legal with a doctor's recommendation in 36 states. I'm not going to go through naming all the 36 states, but there was an amendment that prohibits federal prosecution of individuals that are complying with state medical cannabis laws. So whether we want to, face it as EMS providers or whatever, we are going to encounter individuals across this country who are using cannabis legally for medical purposes. And I'm sure that, places like Colorado, New York, and other places are already encountering those individuals. And in some cases, maybe even encountering individuals that have other medical problems that are actually caused by either overindulgence or increased use of THC. But, I think it's also important that we point out CBD is being used probably more widely than, cannabis that contains THC.
Well, and I think this is a really good point. And before we move on to CBD, there's one thing that I do want to take into account there, because a lot of us know states that are close to us, maybe even bordering to us. And because the state may consider it legal, because it is still considered illegal, again, unless you're talking about those medicinal properties. And even then, it can't be transported into a state in which it's not legal because of that federal ramification. So the transportation of it into an illegal state constitutes a crime as well.
So, I can tell you it's not legal in North Carolina, but it's really been decriminalized for lack of, better terms. Is it legal in Tennessee?
It is not legal in Tennessee.
No, sir. We do not have. We are below the Mason-Dixon line. We have Bibles, we have belts, and iced tea, sweet tea, not unsweet tea.
Coke, not Pepsi.
Yeah, that's what Rhonda said. Coke, not Pepsi. We don't do that weed stuff here, sir.
So you mentioned sweet tea. So I like unsweetened tea. So it was a welcome reprieve when I got to New York and was able to order tea and didn't have to go, I want unsweet tea.
Well, you are one of those strange individuals. We occasionally we may have to renegotiate our contracts here and see which one of us kicks off at the end of the year. No, just kidding.
You guys are getting contracts?
Yeah.
But as you were going on to, I think the next part is probably one of the bigger things, the expansion of CBD into the market. And, I think for EMS providers, that's where we really have to deal. Marijuana has been out there, but because of the efforts against it and the laws that are against it in so many places, CBD has come out fairly, I shouldn't say, fairly unregulated. One of the big things about CBD is the FDA doesn't regulate it. The idea is that as long as it's under 0.3, I think it's milligrams or micrograms, I can't remember the dosing, of THC, then it's legal in a lot of places. Only problem is because the FDA doesn't regulate it, there's no testing on it. And so you get some individuals out there that says 100% THC free, but it's kind of one of those things almost like non-alcoholic beer. If you take a look at that label for non-alcoholic beer, there's still like 0.11% alcohol. It's almost all gone, but there's still something that is there.
Right. And the other part of that is the metabolites, so some people still can have an issue and show up as positive on drug screens and drug tests. And
that's one of the reasons why this episode is pretty timely. And I'm going to bring this message, and we recently had our state EMS board meeting. It was in September, the end of September. And the board had invited the medical director of our professional assistance program that deals with anybody that has a failing drug test, basically, alcohol or drug test. And the main reason that they invited him was because of a substantial increase in the number of cases of positive drug screens associated with THC, in which the individuals come back and said, "Oh, I'm taking a CBD supplement, I take CBD drinks, or I use the CBD creams that are supposed to help relieve pain, and I did not realize that it could come up to cause a negative drug screen." And ultimately, that medical director said, as you just did, the metabolites associated with CBD use are the same as that of THC. It's just going to be the difference in the levels in which show up on the person. And the problem with that is it could be very similar to marijuana use within a couple of days, in which those metabolites have started to come out of the system. And so there's really no way to tell whether it's just marijuana use from a couple of days or if it's CBD use.
Yeah. So I think it's important that we probably talk a little bit about the pathophysiology, since you've kind of dove into that. So our brain and our body is very, very clever. So a lot of people say, well, marijuana is natural. It comes from a plant. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe. Because there are lots of things that are out there, but we get opiate from a plant, and just because it comes from a plant doesn't mean that it's safe. And when we start looking at the levels, our body has an endocannabinoid system, and that endocannabinoid system is designed to respond to the environment just like the fight or flight system is. So basically what happens is before we're born, that endocannabinoid system is important for development, synaptogenesis. So it's important in making the connections for the synapses in our brains, but it's also important for synaptic pruning. So, if the connections are weak or anything else, it causes those connections to break and things to atrophy and go away. And our body, produces natural endocannabinoids that allows us to do certain things, and like, for example, appetite, which is one of the reasons when people have marijuana, and they get the munchies afterwards. So our natural endocannabinoid system, helps control our appetite. Exercise, stress, the time of day causes a different, release of those endocannabinoids. It also works with pain relief. A prime example of that would be, you got a kid that's running on the playground and falls, scrapes up their knees or hurts their knees. what's mom going to do when she scoops that kid up? Mom's going to hold the kid, kiss it, and make it better, right? Well, basically they're releasing, enkephalins, which are very similar and affect the endocannabinoid system. And that's how our body functions, because those endocannabinoids act on the CB receptors that are in our body. Stress, cortisol increases and endocannabinoids are released. So what starts to happen when we have cortisol released, we have endocannabinoids that get released. And the first time that happens, they're released at almost the same rate. The second time that it happens, the cortisol goes down and the endocannabinoids actually rise above that. So that whole thing in the military, we start talking about, stress inoculation. You go out and you do things under live fire conditions. And the more you do that, the stress goes down, the endocannabinoids goes up, which allows us to function in combat environments with, there's still the stress, there's still the cortisol, but those endocannabinoids are what our body starts getting used to and having present, which allows us to be able to do everything else that we do. Now, I've said all that to get into the as part of the pathophysiology to say, well, that's also part of the reason when people leave those environments and continual stressors, stress makes them feel good or they can't function without stress, looking for other things to replace it. And the other thing that replaces it, cannabis. And the problem is once people start using cannabis, their body looks for that continual release or that continual, cannabinoid to be present. And when that happens, their natural endocannabinoids go down. So sometimes people have to continue using more and more, which is why we often find veterans, people who've had, traumatic incidents that get addicted to marijuana.
Well, and actually, you brought up a good point. You bring up a good point about that, because now I'm an ignorant guy coming in about marijuana. What I have learned about marijuana had been two things: whatever I got from paramedic school back in 2004, and Bonnaroo. So those are the only two places. Bonnaroo is a music festival that I used to work at. People who are listening to this who've been there before know what I'm talking about. So one of the big arguments, though, I've heard from students before, from patients and stuff, has been, well, this stuff isn't addictive. And I guess when you're talking about like an alcohol or narcotic, are you talking about that on the spectrum, on the scale of addictiveness?
Well, so when your natural endocannabinoids, start to go down and they're replaced by THC and CBD, but primarily THC is what we're looking at talking about here, then your body looks for that. And then it's going to get those endocannabinoids, one of two ways. Either you're going to get THC, which then competes and binds to the CB receptors, or you're going to go out and look for something to replace that. And the best way to do that is put yourself in a stressful situation. And that stressful situation might be, fighting someone or doing something, or, looking for those highs that you normally get from the cannabinoids. So there are addictive properties to it that are not that it doesn't function exactly the same as an opiate or alcohol, but it does cause the dopamine release as well as the binding to the cannabinoids.
Well, and this is, as I was going through and getting ready today, one of the things that I pulled up is it's a medical news today, and it's basically going over some of the some of the materials that are out there. And this is from September of 2022. One of the things that it talks about is that, a lot of people are like, cannabis doesn't have the same addictive properties. And some of the things that they have seen is that in some individuals it actually does. And one of the things they mention when it comes to CBD specifically is the long-term effects, which we get into some of those addictive properties. This is its specific statement. However, research into the long-term effects of CBD uses is still in its early stages. So, it's one of those things that it's not been around. And, if we kind of take a look at how things were, heroin at one point in time was a medication that was actually prescribed by physicians and such, until they got into some more of the long-term studies and saw some of the harmful properties that it does. And, a lot of things come up and we see those changes. And while in the short term, we may see something along pain relief or stress relief or, some of these other things, it's not until we start to see how things start to turn about after long-term use as to whether they do have those properties. And again, when we take a look at this, when we talk about some of the medicinal uses, those are under very specific circumstances, and those are monitored and take a look. With CBD itself, again, it's not FDA regulated. Just in our town itself, you can buy it in just about any place, including a fish shop, some tobacco sales places, convenience stores. And, so a lot of people think, oh, they're there, so it automatically must be safe and it must not have these addictive properties. But again, you get into some of these individuals with the brain chemistry that they do, and you are going to have some negative effects.
Yeah. And like I said before, just because something's natural and found in a plant doesn't mean that it's safe. And we know that there are some accepted medical uses for cannabis, and that's why it's being prescribed to some individuals. The problem that we get into is, like you said, with the CBD not being regulated. I mean, there's more research actually on THC than there is CBD. But the whole part of this is people may use THC, illicitly, or whether they're using it for medical purposes. And most of the time they're smoking it, whether it's, rolling the joint and they smoke it, or they're using a bong or something else. The problem is when they go out here and they find the brownie or the edible that has it in it. So now they eat that, 20 minutes later, they don't feel the effects of it. So what are they going to do? They're going to eat the second one. Well, now that they've eaten the second one, the first one, they're starting to absorb because they don't understand how it gets absorbed, from the stomach and the GI tract versus the way that it, happens when they smoke it. So now we're dealing with people occasionally who have higher levels and they get sick. We know the antiemetic properties of cannabis are, they work. But the less well recognized is the paradoxical potential for chronic users to develop hyperemesis. So, I actually have a little bit of a case study from a 33-year-old that I had. And unfortunately, he had a history of PTSD, hypertension, gastroesophageal reflux disease. But when we got him, we went there because he had some intractable vomiting. And it began with no precipitating factor. It was bilious, but it was non-bloody. It was happening up to 6 times an hour and had been happening for the last, day. Actually, a couple of days. He had abdominal pain, lightheadedness, and all that was probably due to the dehydration. Had any changes in, sick contacts or anything else. He had some similar episodes over the past few years, but those kind of, subsided. Usually they were centered around some life stressors and a couple other things. He'd been to the physician, been to his doctor, been to the hospital, and he was diagnosed with cyclic vomiting syndrome. But there was something interesting that triggered me to ask him a couple of questions. So I asked him, I said, look, man, you told me just a minute ago that you used marijuana for PTSD. Have you increased your use recently? And he admitted that while he had just used it intermittently, like 1 or 2 days a week, that he had escalated to daily use. And I said, all right. have you felt better, or do you feel better with taking a shower? And he said, man, if I get into a hot bath or a hot shower, as hot as I can stand it, it makes me feel better. It seems to wash away my nausea. And that is a classic thing that you will find with individuals that have cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. So, if you're finding individuals that have that, that probably is the problem is THC gets absorbed into adipose tissue and slowly gets released. So his levels had gone up significantly, and that was what was actually making him sick. It was a paradoxical thing.
So I think one of the big things as we talk about this that we really should get into, and granted, this is not legal advice. None of us here are lawyers, and we're certainly not the lawyers of our listeners that are out there. Even with the fact that there are many states, as you mentioned, medically as well, EMS services do have the ability, because we're out there operating motor vehicles, we are out there treating patients, to write their own policies and protocols that would limit this use as well. So everybody needs to, in this profession, needs to take a look at what is going on in their region and making sure that if they get into the realm of utilizing a product like this may have significant ramifications on their ability to continue to practice emergency medicine within the states that they operate.
Yeah. So let's say the two of you encountered a patient similar to what I just talked about. How would you treat cannabis hyperemesis syndrome? Because I'll tell you, I'm a sympathetic puker. I don't like anybody vomiting in the back of my truck.
Yeah. So, and this is again me not knowing anything about this syndrome. I guess I would just do the typical stuff, which is try some Zofran or even a Zofran drip. Throw it in with some fluids over time. I found that works pretty well. I don't know if there's going to be some interactions with that. If I have Phenergan, which a lot of our trucks have taken that off, but yeah, I try some Zofran. Maybe some Benadryl.
All right. So those were my thoughts as well. But something told me that, hey, wait a minute, there has to be something with THC and serotonin. And, Zofran is a 5-HTC3 receptor site and deals with serotonin. So I decided I was going to get on the line with medical control. And guess what they wanted me to do?
Oh, no.
They wanted something that I would not have even thought about. But it makes sense when you sit back and you look at the pharmacology of it. 5 milligrams of haloperidol.
Haldol.
Yeah.
Oh,
5 milligrams of haloperidol.
Wow. I would have never thought about that. Okay. So what was can you review us on that, on the pharmacological intervention? Because I would have never thought that either.
So, there's, and without getting it, too deep. So THC triggers release of acetylcholine and norepinephrine, dopamine, and basically it produces that paradoxical, emetic response. And there's the whole thing with that is the way the Haldol works. It works to suppress all that. And it makes the nausea go away, just like the individuals getting in the hot bath. And it's really interesting to sit back, and I'm actually going to try to send you some notes on that.
Yeah, because I found it's a pretty interesting case study. This is now, I like going into the weeds on this stuff. Get it? All right. So I'll just go with that. Because I work part time at an urgent care clinic for pediatrics. So a lot of the stuff, 90% of the stuff we see is typical everyday stuff. And you got to remember, at EMS, that is not what we're seeing. Most of what we're seeing is the weird stuff, especially if you're a black cloud out there or something. So this isn't like one off. This is really good information. Again, before anybody decides, hey, I'm going to try this on my next vomiting patient with weed ingestion or something like that in the past few hours, you need to contact your medical control first. But I think that's profoundly interesting that you found this in that case study.
Yeah. And I mean, so the whole thing with Haldol is it actually binds to the CB1 receptor site, which is where THC wants to bind. So as the THC is being released, it competitively binds, making the nausea go away.
Well, that's looking at a review from Cedars-Sinai. That's one of the things that prescribed medications that help calm you down, benzodiazepines, along with some PPIs as far as that stomach inflammation. And it actually makes mention, because the frequent hot showers are something that's in here, but it also makes mention rubbing capsaicin cream on the belly, because it has a very similar, it has a similar effect as those hot showers. So if you can't put them in a hot shower, but not many times do we carry that on the trucks. So
yeah, just spray them with mace. I'm kidding. Don't do that either.
No.
Sounds like good medical advice on this show tonight, guys.
We could say it's the topic, it's highly enlightening, but
we've got like 3 solidly good titles so far. Puff Puff Pass is my favorite, but yeah, that's beside the point. So I like
read the people.
But I wasn't going to say that because I think that's the name of your presentation, so I wasn't going to abscond.
It's okay, it doesn't matter. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to look at it, and in talking with physicians and a couple other things, one of the other things that has presented to one of our local EDs was cannabis induced pneumomediastinum. Basically, they had a 17-year-old that no past medical history that had a night out with his friends, and basically he took the whole thing of inhale to a whole new level, basically. And for whatever reason, it caused some alveolar rupture and subcutaneous air to enter the chest cavity. So he had some subcu air up around his clavicles, and he had a pneumomediastinum simply from that. And sometimes I'll call it bong lung. So
that would be sorry, as soon as you said that, I kind of pulled one up and kind of taking a look at a study as well. Because I had never heard of that myself. So
yeah, these are interesting. Like, and I think we get confirmation bias a lot of times, because if you're listening to this podcast, like I've never come across people with these conditions and stuff. And I got to say, like, even in my history on the truck and stuff, I don't remember it, but I've come across intoxicated people who have no problems with alcohol, weed, and all that stuff. And I never thought maybe the connection between their current presentation and the medications that they were on, because we've learned so much about it. Because I mean, I've always heard that marijuana was a pretty benign medication. That was a pretty benign drug with very low side effects. Pausal rates not bad. Addictive rates so low. Those are the arguments that I kept hearing. But I guess as we're finding out more and more about the chemical structure and what it's actually doing in our bodies, we're finding out it's a little bit more nefarious than benign.
Well, I mean, anything with overindulgence, can pose a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue. Well, I mean, we're also living in a very strange world, right? Where our brains were never meant to task switch or deal with common stress loads the way that we're dealing with them. I mean, look at Facebook feeds and TikTok. Our brains were never meant to handle that kind of stress load early in the day, throughout the day. Within 30 minutes, you're getting hundreds of different tasks that you're switching between on and off. We're messing with our chemicals in our brain all the time. And when I was looking at the history of marijuana and cannabis, it ain't the same stuff that they were growing back in the 1600s when colonial West Virginians farmers were being forced to grow it. The stuff that they got today is way more powerful, as I'm sure some of our friends in the Border Patrol along the Texas border can attest to.
Well, yeah, I mean, anytime that you cultivate something, I mean, corn, for example, the corn has changed over the last, 20 years. And we do a lot of research with different types of corn around here for, that thrive in drought-ridden environments. So anytime that you take something and you continue to tweak, that particular plant, it's going to change over time.
Yeah, and not to mention the way that they're ingesting stuff like polypharmacy. We're not taking into account other medications that people are on, or stuff that it's maybe even being laced. And I think that's something that we're going to be seeing a lot more of. I mean, we live and see it here in the Tennessee area. It is connected to human and sex trafficking by and large. There's all sorts of really bad issues, gang-related issues, economically poor-driven issues behind its use. But that's not always the places where you'll find it either. The days of kind of like caricaturizing people who take routinely weed all the time are not what we would think. Like, it can be anybody. And a lot of times they don't want to tell you until they're in the back of the bus and they know it's safe to tell a healthcare worker and not a police who's walking by and hears it.
Yeah. And 42 to 46% of people have had or have used, marijuana. And you may be picking up an individual that this is their first time that they've had it and they're, having a problem. Or maybe they use it recreationally and they are increasing their use of it.
Well, as we wrap up tonight, guys, let's go ahead and give our last thoughts and not only to EMS providers as far as use, but their treatment if they were to experience some of these things that we talked about tonight.
Well, one of the things I would say is, first of all, follow your local, policies, protocols, and procedures when you encounter these patients, if you do. The other part of that is talk to your medical director. If they want to put a, particular protocol in place for, cannabis hyperemesis syndrome or some of the other stuff that you start to see as you encounter this, then, do that. I would encourage you to talk to your medical director and develop those protocols and educate yourself on the potential issues that you may run into and what patients might be using medical cannabis for. So with that, I will pass it over to Eric.
This is still a substance abuse issue. I'm always an advocate for our professionals, their families, their friends, and their mentality. If you're having an issue or you're dealing with friends and family, you need to understand this is a substance. This is a controlled substance, regardless of why you use it, how it helps you, or whatever. The fact is, if you're having to use it, there's a bigger issue going on, and you need to get that sorted out. Find some help, get some help, find a helpful resources, throw them on an index card, throw some tape around it. This way you can give it to your patients and be like, hey, listen, I know we're going to the hospital for your cardiac condition, but I see that you're using, you might want to, talk to somebody. Here's some resources. That might be a really good way to kind of help our community in a real way without being too judgy.
And I'm gonna take on something that Bradley said there. And one of the things, as a lot of these topics start to come up because of the fact that CBD is becoming readily available. And so if you see some of the stuff in your area, not only work with your local protocols, but if there's not a protocol in place, take the opportunity as a provider that's out there to do the research for your area, write up some information, and then take it to your leadership to write and be involved with that policy development as well. It's one of those things that we're always looking for individuals to step up. And obviously with a protocol such as this, we want to make sure and get details. So take the opportunity to research, find out yourself, and then write it in a way that will help you and your peers go through the information. But as an individual provider that's looking to utilize some of this, one of the things I've experienced in talking to individuals around us, some of the reasons that they have gotten into some of the positions they're in, whether it's a gummy or some of the edibles and stuff like that, and CBD, et cetera. A lot of them are utilizing very similar to the alcohol, in that they're using it to mask some of the stuff that we see. And what I'm going to get into here is just instead of looking to go that route, find somebody to talk to. We've had a couple of resources that are on here that have gone to the mental health side, but one of the things that we have strongly advocated for here is not going to the self-treatment, self-diagnosis, self-treatment side, but finding somebody to talk to, whether it's a colleague, a peer, a friend, family member, or even a trained counselor. There are plenty of resources that are out there, and it's much better to go that route than finding yourself in front of one of the state boards across the country that is having a conversation at the moment about taking your license, which is going to take your livelihood. And we're seeing so many of these. There are cases going across our state's EMS boards, general counsel's desk on a regular basis, where all of this is starting to affect. So if it's one of these for you, take the opportunity to slow down, go have a conversation. Know that just by saying, hey, I ingested or I took or I had a cream with CBD in it and didn't think it was going to show up on a drug test, know that it will, and then it has a possibility of adversely affecting you. When you talk about athletes in the NFL, the NBA, fitness world, if you come up with a positive drug test, you're going to seek a ban. And it really doesn't matter though. You get into the unregulated supplement market and there's some places that do some nefarious things, but you are responsible for what gets put into your body. And if it hits one of those performance enhancing sides, it's going to have significant impact. And we've seen that all the way from a local competitor up to national competitors. And, it's the same for our profession when it comes to CBD. So a lot from me there, but we always like to end our episodes. We like to, personally, I'd like to thank Bradley for bringing this conversation because I think it's really timely with the environment that we're at, both as providers and as our individual selves. So definitely thank him for coming, and Eric and Bradley both for the good conversation tonight. But we also like to do these episodes for your all's edification as well. So knowing what each one of you think is important to us. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, whether you use our Facebook group, our EMS Handoff Facebook group, whether you catch us through our website at emshandoff.com. Make sure to come by and visit, give us a thought. Let us know what you're thinking. If you have topics, guest suggestions, let us know. We always like to hear what you all have to say. So make sure and go to those. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on our YouTube channel as well if you're watching this on video. If you're listening on audio, you can also check us out on the EMS Handoff YouTube channel. All of our episodes going back for since I think about episode 14 has been on YouTube as well. So you can check us out there. Don't forget to go and support us through the EMS Handoff merchandise line at the Pursuit Company, thepursuitco.com. And check out our friends as well as Foam Frat. Give those one more shout out, Tyler and his team over there doing great things. And for gyms, everything they do, they like to support us. and we'll see how things go. So from now on, take care, stay safe, and always remember the value of your EMS handoff.